Good morning, good morning, good morning. I hope everybody recovered from yesterday's an interesting but also exhausting discussions day and night. So we get started. Are you sitting on my glasses?
Oh, am I?
Yeah.
Oh, crap, sorry.
Because I can't do anything without my glasses. So this first panel today is hosted by Reporter Without Borders. And we are going to discuss the Journalism Trust Initiative that was initiated by Reporter Without Borders, if I understand this rightly. So this initiative is based on the assumption that trust builds upon journalism quality. And we will discuss with Lisa Dittmar, who is Advocacy Officer with Reporter Without Borders, about this project. Particularly, I think one challenge was really to find criteria for good journalism that are applicable across borders in countries and continents. And we will hear more about this. And we will discuss with Siddharth Varadarayan from the Wire India, who was one of the pilots of the JTI. And I think this panel is also meant a little bit as a kind of midterm evaluation of experiences. And particularly, we raise the question if trust is actually a universal concept that's also applicable across countries and cultures, or if we need this to be a bit contextualized. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anja, for the kind introduction. Good morning, everyone, to day 2 of the FOME conference. Now, yesterday we've heard about trust, the very concept of it, about the relationship between media and their audiences, about different kinds of journalism and how we can make communities form a bond with their local media. And we've heard about authoritarian states' efforts to curb the very freedoms that international online platforms offer and how they've shaped the relationship between the media and offered new spaces of communication between media and the audiences. Today's presentation is about RSF's response to the challenge of online disinformation. It is also a conversation about the value of transparency as a means of gaining trust in difficult times, and I'm honored to receive Siddharth as a guest today as one of the trailblazers of the Journalism Trust Initiative in India. So why do we bother with disinformation as a press freedom organization? I only have a few minutes, so I'll keep it really brief and only give a partial response, which is maybe my German perspective on the issue. In 2021's Press Freedom Index, Germany was ranked down to a satisfactory situation of press freedom. Now, that might sound good enough to much of the world, but it doesn't sound good enough to us. Because this demotion of Germany in the Press Freedom Index was due to a very sharp rise in violent attacks on reporters, mostly covering public protests against the state's health measures in the COVID times. We saw a 5-fold increase compared to the previous year in violent attacks against reporters, and these were fueled by an online narrative that often revolved around media being liars, being manipulative, giving us the wrong kind of information and the kinds of information that the state wants us to hear. Obviously, we talked about the dangers of conjecture and earlier or easy assumptions yesterday. It's very much too early for proper research into the links between online speech and offline violence that we talked about yesterday in this very case. But, you know, I think it's a very good and educated guess to see a connection between public Telegram channels with hundreds of thousands of followers talking about manipulative media, about a Lügenpresse, a lying press in Germany, and the violence we saw, combined with a political situation in which we see world leaders propagate the very narrative of fake news or manipulative media. The political debate, in turn, has very much revolved around disinformation. Interestingly, I think just one quick fact, in a recent survey, 85% of German internet users, of social media users, were convinced that online disinformation now is one of the leading challenges of our society. Interestingly, though, at the same time, an almost equally large majority of Germans think that they, in fact, are very much protected against disinformation. They know how to identify it, know how to deal with it. So I think there's a gap that we'll have to explain eventually, and maybe it might just be that people are a little bit too optimistic about their very own media literacy. So the political debate in Germany, but also in Europe and beyond, obviously has very much focused on the issue of disinformation and how we can take it down, ideally as fast as possible. Because disinformation largely is in fact legal, lying isn't illegal in most jurisdictions of the world, and it's very much societally an issue, but it's not something that the state can easily give answers to and can easily regulate against with the help of courts. It is something that we've sort of outsourced to online governance, to online platforms, doing their very own online governance. I think there are many questions to be asked about the protections that these platforms accord to freedom of expression, to freedom of the press, and many difficult answers to give about the lack of transparency of these processes, of these decisions that make headlines, and in fact in Germany have been very much welcomed so far. The Journalism Trust Initiative is RSF's response to all of this very difficult backdrop. It is a slightly different approach. It's an approach that is meant to be constructive, to approach this whole subject from a different angle, that of regaining trust, that of offering additional transparency and answer to the question of how can we make those journalists and media outlets who invest in compliance with established journalist standards, and how can we make this visible? How can we make this compliance an asset, not on the level of individual pieces of content, but very much on the level of processes, of editorial standards, such as correction policies, ownership, financial ownership transparency, and so on. It is about making compliance with journalistic standards visible and a financial asset and a societal asset. It was launched by RSF, and the early conversations began in sort of 2017. It was launched publicly in 2018 with interesting and often difficult conversations between roughly 130 representatives from the media sector, from those very platforms that we so often talk about, from civil society, regulators, and academia. The very essence of it is that it is machine readable. It is meant to be a response to online disinformation. So a challenge is in turning standards into something that is readable by, for example, algorithmic indexation, by automatic tools that so very much shape the online platforms that we see today. So to explain it very briefly, because we only have so much time, it is a three-stage process. Essentially, it is an ISO standard. There are standards worldwide, internationally recognized standards for paper sizes, for safe car seats. So why not also for journalism itself and journalistic standards? This wasn't founded out of nowhere. Obviously, journalistic standards have long existed. Self-regulatory standards and good ethical practice in journalism is something that is very much fundamental to media worldwide already. But this is an internationally recognized standard, and I think that's the crucial aspect, that all of these difficult conversations have already happened. And now we've turned it into an online tool that is usable to media of all sizes, whether it's massive public broadcasters or individual bloggers, or just very small upstart media platforms. The first stage is a self-assessment. You go through the essential questions asking you about compliance with these very standards, such as, are you open and transparent about your financial ownership? Do you have a person dealing with readers' complaints? Do you have correction policies in place? And I think what's interesting about this stage is that we found from the early experiences of media of different sizes using it so far, is that the self-assessment in itself starts interesting conversations within editorial teams. What have we written down? What is everyday practice, but we've never really talked about it? So in this sense, and this is the predominant stage that media are in now, that are using or applying the Journalism Trust Initiative to their daily work, is that they start these conversations, that they use it as a tool for themselves in the first place to talk about transparency and daily processes. The next stage is a voluntary disclosure. You can be open about it. If you have fulfilled it as a self-regulatory standard, you can be public about it. You can put it on your About page, and you can start these international conversations about new means of fighting disinformation. The very last stage then is the certification. So we're now in the process of having different auditing companies be certified themselves to check and verify be compliant with their standards. And that's sort of the latest stage that if a few dozen media are in now, they have officially been certified that they've gone through this process and someone has validated their public disclosure efforts. Media so far are very much large and small involved in this, from big publishing houses or international public broadcasters such as RT in Ireland, but also community radios or simple online platforms that are very small. We have media from Western Europe just as much as America. I think almost all continents now. We have The Wire in India, we have community media in Togo in Africa, and so very many else. And we hope obviously to gain the trust of even more media to invest in this effort of very different measures essentially. But what I want to do today is not just to promote this project, but to start a real conversation with one of the trailblazers who has applied it, and that's Siddharth. So I'll move over. And the first we want to tackle today, obviously, is can we gain trust through transparency? India is a very particular and very interesting market for this, I think, and it's a difficult media landscape, a polarized, politically polarized environment for independent news media to operate in. And I think that makes it all the more interesting to talk about how The Wire has applied JTI and what they've experienced in that. And I'll give the word over to Siddharth for the moment.
Thanks very much, Lisa, for that introduction and for talking us through what the JTI involves for those who aren't familiar with it. Before I speak a little bit about our engagement with JTI, I should say a few words about where we at The Wire in India are coming from and why we believe transparency is important. It's often the case that people equate the need for transparency and trust with the fight against fake news. And the assumption is that fake news is something that's quite new. The fact is that fake news is not a new concept. Fake news has been around as long as real news has, but the velocity and the intensity with which it can be shared and spread is arguably much higher today than in the past. So there is a certain salience to dealing with this. But to my view, the problem that media needs to confront squarely is its historical lack of transparency, particularly on the financial and business and managerial side, but also in terms of the opacity which surrounds a lot of its editorial functioning. In India, this problem is compounded by the fact that, separate from the problem of fake news, some of our largest media organizations sell news space in the form, in other words, they will sell news space for money. This is what the Press Council of India has called paid news. And or they bend over backwards to please advertisers because they are overly dependent on advertisers for their funding. And well before the current debate over fake news began, in India, we've been having a discussion going back to the last 15 or 20 years that it's essential that media companies be compelled to be transparent about their sources of revenue, about their tariff cards for advertising of different kinds, so that readers and viewers have a better sense of where the media is getting its money. Because in media, more than perhaps any other industry, we know that the piper calls the tune. So transparency, if we want to re-envisage or reimagine media as we consciously sought to do in 2015 when we started The Wire, to reimagine media as a new social contract between journalists on the one hand and the reader slash viewer slash civil society citizen on the other, then the method for reimagining the social contract had to be transparency about ownership, about functioning, about financing, about editorial methods and practices. So from the start, we were always aware of the need for the wire to be open about its functioning. And we are one of the few media organizations in India to have an ombudsperson, for example. I don't know what they're called in Germany. Do they have a public editor? Somebody who is not part of the editorial chain of command, but who serves as a vehicle to receive reader complaints and to, in a way, adjudicate on them in a way that's binding on us editorially. Very few newspapers around the world have this kind of arrangement. The Guardian pioneered it, I think, in the West, Asahi Shimbun in Asia, in Japan. But we, within a year of launching The Wire, we appointed a public editor or an ombudsperson, and have also gone out of our way to be open and transparent about financing. As one of the few media houses that is, shall we say, quite independent-minded in India, and we often do stories that the government doesn't like. Hence, we earn the displeasure of the government and the government supporters. We noticed a very frequent line of troll attack was, oh, you guys, The Wire gets its money from Soros, The Wire gets it. Well, Soros is not so, Soros is kind of a bad guy among a very, very well-informed section. But the usual allegation is, oh, you guys are paid by Pakistan, you guys are getting money from China, all the enemies of the country are financing The Wire. And people would, and even sometimes well-meaning people would say, would fall victim to this kind of propaganda and ask on Twitter, it's all very well for The Wire to say it's independent, but can you disclose your sources of revenue? And the first time I saw a well-intentioned person asking that question, I said, hey, this is a great opportunity. So if you go to my Twitter timeline, my pinned tweet is where I put up a pie chart of The Wire's earnings over the last, basically since we began. All the major sources of revenue, and there are maybe 5 or 6 heads because we are a non-profit. So there's philanthropic donations, there are reader donations, there's some advertising income, and a couple of contracts that we've done. But the full amounts were there, the percentages were there, and the response we got was amazing. We found that readers were even more willing to donate when they saw that, look, you guys are totally transparent about this. So I think there's a sense in which transparency, if you're honest and open about it, also, it cements that bond with the reader and helps you to gain their trust and for them to then want to support you, support the work. So when RSF came to us with the JTI concept, which is essentially a verifiable, just to simplify what it means, because it took me a few weeks to get my head around it, because we were doing a lot of things that the JTI was asking were questions that we had answered, but you create a kind of certifiable process that is auditable, right? That is, in other words, you get an external auditor to certify. So if you want to belong to the JTI, you adhere to a set of benchmarks of transparency, and then you have somebody outside certify that you are part of this. And I think this is a huge, contribution to, educating or informing the public about what the nature of their media really is. And this goes well beyond concerns of fake news, trust, etc. I think people have a right to know who owns The Wire, who owns the Times of India, how does the money come, how is the money spent, is there an editorial document that guides coverage of issues, and we of course have a lot of internal documents that we are. So in terms of our participation in JTI, we are kind of 90% of the way. And I think in the next couple of months, we will be moving to get ourselves audited and certified. But getting some of the public documentation together. And we also want to address some things that are specific to the Indian context. For example, there's a lot of concern about how violence should be reported, particularly violence that involves different communities. So we will be, putting out there our mission statement, as it were, as an important element of JTI. Besides, another important thing that we do is having an avenue for mistakes to be corrected. It's a great shame that the largest media organizations in India do not have a policy of addressing major factual inaccuracies that appear. If something is egregious, chances are that they will simply pull the page down, and you will get this thing called a 404 error. So a big newspaper may have done a completely rubbish story, and when people point it out, and when the clamor of public outrage is so high that the editor decides, okay, I better take this story down, which can happen, right? Everybody can make mistakes. But when you take a story down, the international standard is that you explain that the story was put up erroneously, this was what was wrong with it, and that's why it's been taken down. But stories will just vanish with no explanation. Newspapers will not print corrections. We have some TV channels that take part in so-called self-regulatory bodies. And when these self-regulatory bodies find in favor of a viewer complaint, which then requires a channel to apologize, these channels will simply resign. So there's one famous case of a pretty horrible channel that got called out by one of these self-regulatory bodies. And their response was to quit that body and set up a new one, where, of course, this complaint would not be addressed in that way. So that's the terrain, that's the landscape that we're dealing with. And we think that despite being relatively small as media, I was happy. I know yesterday I had a debate with our friend from Reuters, the Reuters Institute, about the metric for trust and how, and it was a bit unfair for me to ask that question because we were quite pleased in one of the reports for The Wire to feature in the survey as one of the trusted, top 10 trusted media. So we are very happy at that kind of recognition, but we think that it's important to also develop a more organic process for building trust. And we hope that despite being small, the example of The Wire, particularly when we complete our certification and auditing process, or get it externally audited, that this would serve, we would hope to encourage other media and big media in particular to adopt this kind of an approach for ensuring that the public is well informed about the structure. Final point, you always have to prepare yourself for Big Brother, doing things that you avoid doing. Now, throughout the world, there is an active debate on the degree to which media should be regulated or self-regulated. The ills and evils of the media are well catalogued and documented. In Britain, for example, or the US, everywhere. You have tabloid culture and all kinds of awful journalism. And invariably, the excesses of this kind of journalism give rise to a clamor for some form of accountability or regulation. And we all know that even in the most well-developed democracy, it's highly dangerous to give politicians even an indirect say in deciding on content, in designing or implementing a regulatory structure. It's dangerous. And of course, in a country like India, it's highly dangerous. What we've seen is a move by the government over the last 2 or 3 years, but in particular since the pandemic. And beginning from this February, they've created a new law, allegedly in order to get digital media to act responsibly. So they've created a law which mandates every digital media house creating what they call a grievance redressal officer, whose job is to serve as a clearinghouse for reader complaints, address those complaints within 24 hours. And if the reader is not satisfied, the reader then has the right to escalate that complaint to a second level body and finally to the government directly. And the government will then decide whether that reader's complaint is valid or not. Now, this may sound reasonable at some level, because why should a media house not want to address a reader's complaint? The problem arises when reader complaints are weaponized by political parties. As you can imagine, if you had this kind of system in the US, and Donald Trump gave a call for thousands and millions of his supporters to flood the grievance redressal officer of CNN or New York Times with identical frivolous complaints. And then the New York Times is obliged legally to address those complaints. And finally, it's the White House that will decide. It's not, you can't have this kind of a system. It's crazy. And so the Wire has challenged this law. We've gone to court and we've got a stay right now. And we are very confident that when the Supreme Court hears this matter, they will recognize that this represents an unconstitutional ingress on media freedom. But we found that, despite the Supreme Court, despite the High Court's stay, the government keeps writing to us to comply. And I was looking at their questionnaire and the form they want us to fill out. And I was laughing because I said, this information that you want us to fill out, such as the name of the editor, how do you contact the editor, where can readers send their complaints to, who owns the domain of the, I said, all of this has been in the public domain as far as the Wire is concerned since when we started. So what great information, what great contribution are you doing for media transparency? So it's ridiculous. The whole idea is to control. So I'll stop there and say, that I think RSF's, I think it's significant that, a final point I'll make, Lisa, is that, it's gratifying and in the fitness of things that RSF, which has been fighting for media freedom all these years, is precisely the body that has recognized the need for trust in media. So we're not just fighting for media freedom in the abstract and saying that whatever we do is fine and you have to defend us. We are accepting, RSF and those who are part of JTI are accepting that media has a responsibility. And the challenge is to find a way of discharging that responsibility in a way that is open, transparent, and which actually strengthens the freedom of press rather than weakens it. And I think that this kind of a format that the JTI envisages, where you take your information and you put it in the public domain and have it certified, this kind of an initiative, I think, will strengthen that bond between the reader, viewer on the one hand and media on the other. And in doing so, safeguard freedom of the press from the kind of attacks which are happening today and which are going to come in the future. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Siddharth. Before we go into questions from the audience and our online audience as well, I just want to ask one question. I found really interesting that from our early experience and from what you've just been talking about, it is those very short-staffed, small media outlets who see the value in this initiative, who see the value in transparency, and who with their limited resources sort of lead the charge on fighting off repressive state regulation as a response to disinformation. So how would you speak to the big media platforms that are apparently not so much investing in this fight? How would you convince them?
Yeah, so it's interesting that the rule that's been made in India for appointing grievance redressal officers and so on, which is seen as an ingress, as an attack on media freedom. Of course, the target is digital media, but invariably it has affected everybody because the largest newspapers have websites. And you can't have a law that targets only the Wire's website and not the Times of India's website or CNN, IBN, which is a big TV channel in India, their website, right? So this applies to everybody. So we found that in the initial weeks and months, big media was kind of hemming and hawing. Their first attempt was to meet the minister and say, well, we are legacy media and we are anyway very responsible. So we should be exempted from this. But clearly that was not legally tenable. And when they realized that, they too have joined the fight against this law. But on the larger question that you're raising, which is of initiatives like JTI, it's going to be uphill because the largest media companies thrive on lack of transparency. And the biggest newspaper in India is not even a publicly listed company. So it's the Times of India Group owns the largest English newspaper, one of the largest Hindi newspapers. It owns the largest TV channel and the largest FM radio. And this is owned by a family. It's a private limited company. So even the kind of disclosure that you could sometimes expect through the stock market, right? Through the stock exchange, because of the regulatory requirements, do not apply in the case of this company. And the same is true for many, many media organizations in India. So to expect them to want to come clean or to be transparent about the full range of things, it's a tall ask. But again, I'm hoping that we start with examples from. We are nonprofit, so it's quite easy for us. But maybe there are a couple of smaller for-profit digital sites, some newspapers. It's possible that the battle can be won that way.
Any questions from the audience?
Hello, yeah, thank you for this presentation. I'm curious about the concept of trust you have as your foundation, and whether it's grounded on different contexts and different theories, because as we all know, when we apply those, I just use the simple term Western concepts, that we have the problem that we miss context, and then we have an institution which certifies trust in different regions. And I would, from my perspective, without knowing what the method is behind this question, this application of such a concept to different contexts.
I think, to put it very briefly, it starts from a measure of trustworthiness, if anything. We should probably be careful to talk about trust and trustworthiness and the differences between. It starts from an established ground of editorial practices that I think to some extent are universal. But I am curious to see, that was the big question we asked today. Is this a universal approach? Does this work everywhere? And it's very much sort of a test and an experiment for us as well. And as RSF, I think we are in touch with media platforms from all over the world. And it was very much an effort to come up with an approach that works for everyone, whether large or small, wherever you come from. I think, interestingly, what I've just heard really reflects international debates and international discourse that I've seen. But I am curious to learn about the differences as well. And I think this experiment will certainly bring up questions of national differences, of differences between media, whether advertising financed or reader financed, and so on. But I'm interested to get your perspective.
If I can, I think that's a great question. And we can't answer it unless we try to unpack the ingredients of trust. In other words, what is it that would make a reader, and I'll stick to sort of text media right now, newspapers and websites. What is it that would make a reader trust what she reads in a website or a newspaper, right? So I think she needs to know that there is no conflict of interest. Or she needs there to be transparency. If you read an article praising Royal Dutch Shell for its environmental practices, you would feel much happier if you can satisfy yourself that the media house that has run this article has no connection whatsoever to Royal Dutch Shell, either as an advertiser or as an investor or whatever. And that's just one example. No conflicts of interest is an important part. Knowing what are the editorial principles that cover or that govern the way in which stories are covered. In other words, being able to look up a document or to use that document as a reference point to then judge a story that's been published is another possible method. There are, of course, some purely subjective aspects of trust, which an initiative like this or any initiative can't address. A lot of the trusts, there is a political, ideological aspect to trust, and I think it's very difficult to somehow objectify that by way of a metric. But certainly in terms of the some of the objective criteria, and often this is the case. I mean, like, I'm a voracious reader of news, and when I come across something that I find unusual, like a news report about, say, something that's happened in Palestine, or I'm trying to remember. There was a news item a while ago about Julian Assange, and somebody sent me this forward, which basically said, "Why is the world's media silent about this latest attack on Julian Assange?" And I read this piece, and I had never heard of the outlet. And my decision, I would have been keen to follow that story up if that website has something so basic as an About Us section. Like, you'd be shocked to know most digital media do not have a proper About Us, where you can click, see who the people are, see who owns it. And that's not even 5% of the information that the JTI would give a reader if you have a certified. So I think that being open and transparent about some of these things can help, but you're right. I mean, there are going to be major differences from place to place. And above all, we can't deal with the subjective aspect. So if somebody in India is a Hindu nationalist, then they will likely be more trustworthy of media that they reckon reflects that Hindu nationalist point of view. And there's very little that can be done by this kind of a process to deal with that element of trust. But what it can do is that it can take away the argument, so that Hindu nationalist reader will find it that much more difficult to dismiss something that's appeared in The Wire if she can see that this is how The Wire is financed, this is how The Wire is run. So we see great value, even in tackling that aspect, which is so hard to quantify or objectify.
Another question there, but well, we're the first session of the day, so we get to be greedy with time.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Timo from DW Academy. I was wondering, I mean, I realized that, of course, there's an overlap between, like, credibility and revenue to some degree, but not necessarily as we see with tabloid papers, for example, right? But just hearing that, I'm wondering how much of the motivation of people who want to join the JTI is actually about revenue rather than credibility. Because when I see something like that, my immediate thought was like, oh, this is really attractive for donors. Because I could see like a donor being like, oh, I'm now only going to find, organizations that are actually doing that. So I'm kind of curious, how much is this about, just attracting money from other sources, and how much is it actually about quality? Particularly since yesterday we also heard a little bit that a lot of readers or viewers don't really care about the processes. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I was wondering, like, I would say that probably the news organizations that would consider this or are already doing it, they're not the news organizations that lack of trust in leadership. Like the sort of the problematic ones, like how do you encourage them to do it? And if you cannot really encourage them to do it, like to put it like strongly, what's the point? In a sense, like more transparency is great and all, but like I'm really wondering, how do you get the people that we look at to really be more transparent about their things? And yeah, have you thought about that?
Thank you very much for challenging and really interesting and good questions. I think to the first point, the interesting part was that RSF clearly started out in our communication. We've always been quite open that this was an effort to counter disinformation. We saw a political challenge. We came up with a sort of pragmatic response to it with media partners. But what we then found now applying it in the early stages, and this is a young project, so I think we'll learn much more still, is the motivations for joining are very, very varied. So you do get actors like RTE that very much frames it in the fight for against disinformation, in the fight to reestablish a public broadcaster in its credibility, in its very much in its legacy that they see threatened by all of these online discourses. But then you also get, and I think the majority right now are actually smaller media platforms that think, that are often not for profit, that do think about their relationship with with donors, with their readers as well. So I think it's very varied, and we're seeing that this could actually play a much larger role in the self-assessment stage, in kicking off internal processes first, in developing practices within the media group or within the media house and within the editorial teams first, and then see what financial incentives might come off that. But I think it doesn't actually play the key role for many media for now. They actually really want to get into these internal conversations first, and then they'll see whether a certificate might also start with, or might also eventually bring financial incentives. And that's maybe the key part then going into the second part, which is how do you get the larger media platforms? The issue obviously is that, especially in this whole political discourse right now about disinformation and about their relationship with online platforms, is that they have much less incentives really to get into this whole self-regulatory business. What they are seeing is they can simply use their financial weight to get into direct negotiations with Facebook, with Twitter, with Google. So I think it's much more difficult to get them interested in the standard in the first place. And obviously we'd hope that if Facebook and so on, all these larger platforms did use JTI as, for example, a factor of promoting the visibility of certain platforms, because what Twitter, for example, does now is obviously, well, demote or label state media, for example. So it's all very much destructive for now. JTI isn't meant to kick anyone out. It's not meant to demote anyone. It's meant to promote compliance with certain standards. But I think that could be a key issue then if Facebook and Google, who have actually been part of the early discussions, but are now, you know, still on the edge of using it, it'll be critical that they actually make use of these constructive methods and reward the trustworthiness. And then I think there's a sort of hidden financial agenda in the end attached to it, because obviously right now it's not just about who's visible and what is visible, but also the financial relationship between social media companies and the media at large.
If I just add, you're right. I mean, I think those who are already trusted are likely to gravitate, but don't forget that trusted by whom? Every media, good, bad, ugly, have a core of readers who trust them. And the challenge for all of these media houses, whether they admit it or not, is to win some degree of acceptability beyond that converted group. You know, even your most right-wing horrible media would much rather have a certain currency beyond the fringe, and not just for reasons of revenue, but also for reasons of you know, the overall impact and so on. So the beauty of a JTI kind of approach is that actually, I think it's ideology neutral. And you know, the benchmarks that people are being asked to comply with are benchmarks that I hate the term mainstream media, but any mainstream media organization should not have difficulty in fulfilling the criteria. What this process will do is to separate fly-by-night media. Now, some among MSM may be fly-by-night. A lot of new media is fly-by-night, and they would not be able to have themselves certified. Many of them don't even want to make a simple disclosure like who owns the media. And so I think that having it's in the interest of a wider group of media platforms to do this. And in response to your question about money, this is not a factor for us, frankly, but I do see how we do not anymore get really much funding from philanthropic foundations. So our 80% of the Wire's revenue month on month comes from readers, and the remaining 20% is sort of advertising, programmatic advertising, Google, YouTube, this sort of thing. But we do reckon that being part of an initiative like JTI, particularly if more and more media are part of it, and people see this as an ecosystem that is healthy, that this would also enlarge our pool of readers. And by enlarging our pool of readers, naturally open the door for healthier bottom line, more finances. But I don't think, I wonder if for any media organization, that's the primary goal or concern.
All right, I'm being signaled to wrap up. Clearly much to talk about, and we'll be happy to come back next year, maybe with the Reuters Institute and their first answers to many of the questions asked today. So thank you very much.